Hey guys, I'm Double D, and today I'll be talking about 5 basic concepts of web programming. Before I get into it, I want to say that I did a video called 5 basic concepts of programming. Obviously, all the ideas from that video still apply here because web development is just a specific branch of programming. So if you want, you can check out that video first. All the comments and the feedback on that video were very positive, which I'm proud of and very thankful for. Anyway, on to the first concept, which is the web galaxy. Now, this is not a standardized term. This is just something I decided to call the first concept to give you an idea where web development is as a galaxy in the programming universe. Web development is the process of developing a website for the internet. By nature, it's a lot different compared to, for example, C# development, but it also has similarities. I think that most people who get into programming start off with standard object-oriented languages like C# or Java. So throughout this video, I'll be making a lot of comparisons between those concepts and web development concepts. Anyway, the main thing I want to explain about this first concept is the fact that you, as a developer, have to be comfortable with change. You must welcome change, because if you don't, you're never gonna grow and get better at what you do. I think this goes for many things in life, but it definitely goes for programming. When you start learning a new language or technique, you will have to change how you think. Same goes for web development. If you've learned any languages before it, you'll probably have to change the way you think. You'll change your IDE or your code editor, your project file structure, and more. And it will be strange at first, it will be uncomfortable, but you need to remember that you have to do it in order to grow and learn. This is a general concept for learning any new programming language, but you don't have to worry about it too much if you haven't learned any languages before. And to be more precise, when I started learning web development, I obviously changed the programming language, which meant I had to change the way I write code, because obviously some things that work in C#, for example, won't work in JavaScript, and vice versa. I changed the IDE from Visual Studio to Visual Studio Code, and I also changed how I structure my code and the files within my project. This was a lot at first, and I found myself questioning why do I have to do things this way, when I already have a good routine of doing things my way. But I stuck through it, I trusted the process, and it was definitely worth it. I would also like to point out some of the advantages of web applications as opposed to standard desktop applications to keep you motivated to learn web development. So first off, web apps are cross-platform. This means that you can use the same web application on any smart device you have, your phone, tablet, laptop, desktop, watch, fridge, whatever. This is because web applications are executed in a browser, as opposed to a desktop application which is executed on an operating system. I'll talk more about this later in another concept, but what you can take away from this is that a web application is portable, which is a big advantage today. Secondly, there's no installation needed. Since web applications are ran through a web browser, there's no need to install the app itself. The only thing you need is a browser, which most operating systems have installed by default. Everything the developer needs to do is deploy the app onto a web server. Number 3, no updates needed. Whenever the app needs to be updated, the developer can push a server update, and that update will automatically be visible to all the clients. This is much more simple than having to download the installation file, installing it, and then using it, which is what you need to do in order to update a desktop application. And we all know that app updates can happen frequently, so this is a big plus. Number 4, more intuitive design. In most cases, web apps are designed more intuitively because they are developed for multiple platforms, which means that the design is either responsive or adaptive, or a combination of the two. Number 5, good shareability. Usually web apps have a good way of connecting you with other web apps and profiles you have online. They make it easy to share the data from the app with someone else on the internet. Desktop apps do this by using a built-in browser, or they just link you to a website where you can share something, which is not as intuitive. Anyway, these are some of the reasons why web apps are becoming so popular. Obviously, there are some disadvantages, and there are cases where desktop applications are the way to go, but that's not the topic of this video. On to the next concept, which is the web app file structure. While every project is a story for itself, especially when talking about the server side of things, most projects will have a similar structure when it comes to the client side of things. Every web project will consist of HTML files, CSS files, and JS or JavaScript files. These are all languages that define how your application will look and how it will work when it's opened in the web browser. An HTML file looks like this. Its purpose is to define the structure of a web page. It consists of HTML tags. Each tag is opened and closed, and everything in between is the content of that element. Tags can also have attributes. For example, this tag is called the div tag, and it has an attribute called class. His class is called blue square, and his content is just some plain text that reads blue square. A CSS file looks like this. Its purpose is to define the style of the HTML elements. This is where you define how an element looks, how big it is, what's its position, background color, font size, width, and much more. For example, earlier we defined an element with the class called blue square. In CSS, we would write something like this, where we would define the background color of the square, as well as its width and height. Finally, a JS file defines the behavior of the web page. This is what a JS file looks like. Here I defined what would happen if I clicked on the square. I wrote a function that triggers every time an event occurs, which is in this example the click of the blue square. If we run this application in a browser, we can see that we have an element, a div, which we defined in the HTML file. The div has a blue background, which we defined in the CSS file, and when I click on it, a message pops up, which is defined in the JS file. This is the basic structure of files you will see in almost every web project. Another good thing about web development is that it's fairly easy to separate the work that needs to be done. This means that if you're working with a team, someone on the team can be working on the front end of the application, aka the app interface and all the things that the end user gets to see, and someone else can work on the application's back end, aka the logic of the application and all the things that happen behind the curtain. And if one person knows how to do both ends of the application, he would be considered a full stack developer. But in most cases, people have different roles within a team, and with different roles they work with different file types. Something that enables teams to work together on a project at the same time is a version control system like GitHub. People can submit their part of the work onto a repository where the project as a whole is hosted. They can access other parts of the project they need, and they can also switch between previous versions of the project. But more on this later. The third concept is the architecture of a web application. This is a concept I didn't fully understand when I got into web development, but I think it's really important to understand it from the start. So, the architecture of a web application can be described with this picture. Let's see what we have here. There's the client side on the left, the server side on the right, and the communication channel in the middle connecting them together. On the client side, at the very top, we have the presentation layer. It consists of HTML, CSS, and JS files, which I talked about earlier. This is the highest layer of the stack, and it's the one that's closest to the end user. Then we have the web browser, which takes all these components and puts them together into a web page, which is then displayed to the user. The web browser uses local storage for things like cookies. A cookie is a piece of information stored locally on the user's machine after the user accesses the website. Cookies can be used for storing information like usernames, passwords, any other input data, users' preferences on the website, etc. Finally, at the bottom of the stack is the operating system, where the browser is installed and executed. On the server side, at the very top, we have the logic layer. This is where the core business logic of the application is. If you've learned languages like C# or Java before this is pretty much the only layer you ever knew existed. It's where you write your classes, define their behavior by writing functions, and so on. For this layer on the server side, you can use technologies like ASP.NET in C#, JavaScript using Node.js, PHP, Python, and many more. Notice how there's JavaScript on the list, even though we already said that JavaScript is used on the client side. Well, it can be used for both. I think that's pretty important to remember. The next layer on the stack is the web server layer. This layer's job is to establish a communication with the client side using the HTTP protocol. In other words, this layer takes your web application and deploys it onto a web server, where it becomes accessible to any client in the world. This is done by many web hosting companies who usually charge the hosting service monthly. The most notable web servers are Apache and Nginx. This is something that I've always wondered about, and that was so mysterious to me because nobody taught us in school. They showed us how to make a simple website using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and we could open the website locally in the browser and it worked. But it still wasn't visible to anybody else. So how do you actually publish it? Well, this is the answer. You take your application to one of the web hosting companies and they deploy it onto a server, which is ran on a large number of powerful computers. The next layer is the storage layer, aka the database layer. Every standard web application requires storing some type of data, whether it's information about the user accounts, website statistics, banking info, or something else. You need a database to store it. Two most notable database management systems are MySQL and Oracle's DBMS. The next layer on the stack is of course the operating system. There are certain operating systems built specifically for running a server, such as Microsoft Windows Server and Ubuntu Server. Finally, the layer that holds all these components together is the infrastructure layer, which is the raw hardware of the system. It is important for a server to have a strong infrastructure because it has to be able to handle a large number of client requests at the same time, it has to do it fast, and to make sure the server is safe. Last but not least, there's the communication layer between the client side and the server side, which enables the communication between the two sides using the HTTP protocol. And that's the architecture of a standard web application. It is fairly more complicated compared to the one you might have been used to before, but it does offer many advantages that I've talked about earlier. On to the fourth concept, which kind of goes off of the last one, and it's the server-client concept. I think I explained what each side consists of, but how does it actually work? Here's a real-life scenario. A user on a website wants to make a new account and wants to register as a member of your app. He fills in all the info, his name, username, password, date of birth, and clicks on register. What happens then is the client is sending a request to register as a new user, along with the data required to do so. The server then receives the data, validates each of the inputs, and if the data is valid, it imports it into the database. Then it returns a message saying that the registration was successful. If any of the inputs were invalid, the server would return an error message. While all this is happening, the client is waiting. This is when you would usually see a loading animation on the website indicating that something is happening. This back and forth communication between the client and the server takes some time, and while that time is passing, it's good to let the user know that something is happening rather than freezing the application while the job is done. This introduces a new concept, and that is asynchronous programming. Simply put, asynchronous programming enables you to execute one thing and then execute another thing without having to wait for the first one to finish. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. This is a topic for another video. Something that happens on the server side while the communication is happening is that the server may receive a large number of requests at the same time. If it can't handle all of them, it can pass a request to another machine or even another server. There are algorithms that decide how to distribute client requests on the server side so that all of them can be handled very fast and secure. This is all fine, but how do you actually send a request to the server? Well, in JavaScript, you can use the function called fetch. The code would look something like this. You specify the type of the method, like get, post, put, etc. You specify the content type and some other metadata, and you pass the actual data, which would be user inputs in our previous example. As a return value, you would get a response from the server, which you can further use accordingly. For establishing communication between the client and the server, you can also use technologies like AJAX. Although the code looks similar, AJAX works a bit differently. It allows you to send and receive data asynchronously in the background without interfering with the current state of the website. Usually, with a fetch request, the received data would be displayed after the website is refreshed. This isn't the case with AJAX, which means you can communicate with the server without having to reload the page. Hopefully this gave you some insight on what happens behind the curtains when a request is sent to the server. And maybe next time when you see a loading animation on a website, you'll remember this. The last concept I wanted to talk about today is perhaps the most interesting one. So let's talk about web APIs and web tools. Simply put, a web API, or Application Programming Interface, is an interface that allows you to interact with an external service using a simple set of functions. Some APIs charge you for using them, and some are completely free to use within your application. For example, there's a football API that gives you data about the live scores, football events, match standings, and more. There's a weather API that gives you data about the current or future weather for a specific location. And the list goes on and on. There's an API for everything today, and I think that is truly amazing. It gives you, as a developer, so many options, and it gives you so much freedom. If you're interested to see what are some of the most popular APIs in the world right now, I left a link for that in the description. Maybe you even get an idea for your web application. Anyway, since web development has been around for long enough for people to come up with all these services, you can only imagine what other things you can find. We're only scratching the surface here. However, I would like to mention a few other tools which are crucial in web development. One of them is Bootstrap and Bootstrap-like libraries. Bootstrap is a free CSS framework which enables you to make responsive, well-designed and intuitive apps very easily. Take a look at these two examples. The one on the left is plain HTML with no style, and the one on the right uses Bootstrap CSS classes. So if you want to make your app pretty, use Bootstrap or something similar. Another must-have tool for web development is a version control system, the most common one being GitHub. I talked about this earlier, and I said that GitHub makes collaboration on a project very easy. It enables project and team management, it facilitates code review, and tracks all versions or states of your application. In my opinion, you should get familiar with GitHub because it really is a useful tool, and besides, every good IT company requires you to work with some sort of version control software. So starting with GitHub is probably your best bet. And those are the 5 basic concepts of web development I wanted to talk about today. Although some of these topics I mentioned today deserve a separate video, I think I covered pretty much everything I wanted. If you're interested in hearing in more detail about something, make sure to let me know in the comments. I'd also like to point out that I'm not a web developer myself. I'm still in the process of learning and discovering things about this topic, but I thought it would be helpful if I shared what I learned so far. Anyways, that's it for now. If you have any questions or ideas about my next video, leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.